Hello, in this lesson, I want to provide a brief architectural overview of the Kubernetes control plane that we're going to be installing in this section of the course. So we're going to be setting up the Kubernetes control plane, and here I've got the architectural diagram, and this diagram shows ultimately the final state of our Kubernetes cluster, but I have most of the diagram down here at the bottom grayed out. And that's because these are the components that we're going to be working on later. These components up at the top are the ones that we're going to be working on in this section. So I wanted to give you kind of an idea of the architectural end state of this section of the course where we're installing and setting up the Kubernetes control plane. Essentially what we're doing is we're setting up our two controllers. Now, we already did etcd in the last section, so we're not going to be doing etcd here because that's already been done, but we are going to be doing these remaining services. So you can see I've got some services listed here, and what we're going to be doing is on each controller, both controller 1 and controller 2, we're going to be installing the Kube API server, the Kube controller manager, and the Kube scheduler. So we're going to install and set up those three services. And we're also going to set up this small little Nginx server on each of these controllers. And what that does is it's going to proxy this health Z endpoint. And when we get ready to do that, I'll explain a little bit more about why that step is part of Kubernetes the hard way. And finally, once we set up these two controllers, we're also going to go ahead and set up a load balancer for the Kube API service. You can see I've got a little arrow coming out of this Nginx load balancer, and it's pointing to these two Kube API server services. So we're going to be setting up a load balancer that's capable of balancing traffic to the Kube API server. Now, the reason for that is later on, we'll be able to communicate with the Kubernetes API through that load balancer. So, for example, when our workers' kubelets communicate with the API, they will get load balanced usage of the API through this load balancer, as well as if we communicate with it remotely using, for example, a remote kubectl when we're actually interacting with our cluster to maintain and manage our cluster. We can interact with it using the Kube API load balancer, and that allows us to balance that load across multiple Kubernetes controllers. So ultimately, we could have any number of Kubernetes controllers and have a more highly available setup because we are load balancing that Kube API server usage. So that's just a brief architectural overview. Just to recap, we're going to be installing these three services as well as setting up this small Nginx server. And finally, we'll be setting up this Kube API load balancer. And once we've done all those things, we'll have a fully functional load balanced Kubernetes control plane, and we'll be ready to go on and start setting up our Kubernetes workers.